uh, early chats. And what I was saying earlier is that I'm just going to give you a little bit about my background, where I'm coming from all of this, what my interests are. But I then do want, or I would prefer, be more fun for me, if this turned into a sort of more discursive Q&A discussion type thing, because I'm always interested in other views as well. So just on my background, so I've come into being an academic quite late, actually. My undergraduate degree was in literature and languages, Russian and German, which took me into a career in banking, which is where I met Alexina Cassidy. I was a banker for about 8 years in the city. And towards the end of my time in banking, I was rather curious about why the city, which I was working in, was allowed to work in some of the ways that it worked. And it made me think a little bit about politics. A lot of the things that the city did ended up having sort of quite deeply political consequences, not just in the UK, but often in other parts of the world with much lower incomes than the UK. So when I finished with the banking, I thought I'd like to study something that would help me to understand that a bit more. Hence, I did a master's in international political economy, thinking about the ways in which politics and the economy intertwine. And actually, that's a really interesting basis for thinking about the politics of climate change, because if you think about it, in order to reduce GHG emissions globally, a lot of the ways in which our economy operates are going to have to change. And a lot of the drivers for that are policy drivers and political drivers. A lot of the constraints are also political, but politics does both of those things. So I did a master's and then I did a PhD, and then I've sort of established my career around looking at the politics, the political relationships, the power relationships often that sit behind processes of policy making. So making policies mainly in the area of mitigating for climate change, and mainly in the area of sustainable energy, although I've looked at other sectors as well. I've looked at national level policies and politics in the UK and Germany, a little bit in Denmark. I've looked at the EU level, and now I'm actually doing a bit of work on the geopolitics of global energy transformations. So I've looked at this at sort of at most scales. And my starting line really is that there is no avoiding the politics of climate change. We may not like it, we may find it incredibly and deeply frustrating, but I think that we ignore it at our peril if we are genuinely interested in reducing global GHG emissions in a way that gets buy-in from publics, not just publics in the global north, but publics in the global south as well. So something that's a little bit more just than the way that we've been doing it thus far. And so I think that you have to recognize how political this is. So obviously climate change is political because there are uneven outcomes between countries in the world, but also within society. So even within the UK, clearly some people will suffer more as a result of climate change than some others. Some of that has to do with incomes, but some of that has to do with geography and where you're living. Clearly, climate change mitigation is political because what's happening is unprecedented in its scale and in the pace of change required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in time to meet various UNFCCC and IPCC scientific standards that have been set. So one of the latest things is IPCC's advice that we need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. So we're not talking about small amounts of change here. We're talking about really considerable change that will have impacts for people everywhere in the world. Basically, the positive impact is that we hopefully will be able to avoid the worst of climate change in terms of its impacts on societies. So it's a general outcome, but of course there are other outcomes that aren't related to GHG emissions, and they're more social and economic outcomes. So if you are working from high carbon practices, you obviously stand to lose some investment, you stand to lose your job. So that's another way in which climate change mitigation is political, because it has other kinds of outcomes than saving the planet. And then the third way in which I'm going to talk about it being political is that if you look at any of the models that have been put together to show us how we get to 1.5 degrees and sort of maintain that by the 2050, or to net zero by 2050, all of those models assume that policies will drive change. And it's very hard to have policies without politics, because it is political institutions that make policies. Now, of course, there will be policies in corporations, there will be policies that NGOs and other groups of people pursue, but in many ways, and if you, I don't know if anyone's at all familiar, there's a whole bunch of research on how big transitions in society have happened historically in these sort of technical and social type sectors. And in all of those, policies are required either to drive the change or to make sure that the changes that take place, the new technologies that come in, are shared widely across society and become affordable for everybody in society. So there's kind of no avoiding the politics. And I'm kind of going on about that a little bit because I know that there are some NGOs, some activist groups, and parts of the scientific community who would just like to get rid of the politics. Wouldn't it be just better if a bunch of experts in an enclosed room were allowed to just get on and make the policies? But doing that in reality is, well, within democracies where you have some idea of what's going on, it's quite difficult. And then you also, of course, then cut off the link between policy making and voters, which is also kind of problematic in democratic societies. So that's my kind of spiel, where I'm coming from on all of this. And I'm really happy to let you ask me any questions that you can think of about climate, politics and policy. It can be UK, it can be local, it can be national, it can be global. The floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm sure people have already got questions bubbling away in their minds, but to sort of start with some of the questions that we had sent in, and I'm sure the discussion will develop as we go along. So I'm going to start, first of all, with the question that Rupert Knowles put in and then has apparently forgotten. So hopefully this will be new to everybody. This, I think, is quite a big question. So how do we raise climate change up the agenda for the mass of voters? At the moment, there are few votes in climate action. And I feel like that kind of speaks quite well to the very last point that you made, Caroline, which is about the connection between voters and democracy. Because actually, if voters aren't bothered about climate change, how can we make the right policies if that's not what they think they're interested in?
Okay, well, this is a great question. I love this one. And there are all sorts of ways of doing it. But I suppose I would like to start with the fact that climate change has actually become what's called in policy terms a valence issue. So it has become an issue where there is cross-political party support in many high-income countries, so mainly many countries in the global north. So if we think back to where we were on it 20 years ago, or even actually 10 years ago, it is an issue that people do now care about, like whether that's because of David Attenborough and his fabulous programs, particularly that one on plastic, which sort of made such a sort of huge impact. Whether that's because of demographics. I mean, young people generally are pretty passionate about climate change because they see it as impacting them in ways that I'm over 50, so quite frankly, I won't be impacted in the way that they're being impacted. And it has partly to do with education because they now learn climate change at school. So they learn it in geography, they learn it in chemistry, so they sort of learn it in sociology, they learn it in a number of subjects, mainly as they get older. So climate change is up the agenda massively in this country versus where it used to be, and in most countries of the global north. Maybe not the US so much, where it's remained more of a party political type issue. So obviously Democrats on board, the part of the Republican Party that has dominated over the last 7 or 8 years, or not on board, clearly. But then there are divisions within the Republican Party as well. So I think we should all feel reasonably happy that this has come up the political agenda. But there's way more work that needs to be done on this, and the work that needs to be done on it isn't so much raising awareness, but it's raising awareness of just how much climate change will change people's lives everywhere in the world. I mean, parts of the world will become uninhabitable. And I think sort of sometimes in the global north, we think, well, it'll be warmer in the summer and people elsewhere may be badly off, but well, it doesn't really impact me. Whereas the future under a lot of warming means that the parts of the world that are uninhabitable, people will leave. And they will leave in their hundreds of millions. And so if you know, some parts of the global north don't like immigration very much, I think they need to think about climate change and its implications in relation to those kinds of issues. So that's sort of one part of it. The other part of it is that what we don't do is discuss much what to do about it. So a lot of what we hear in relation to climate change through media and social media and various other platforms are often the negatives. And people don't talk very often about the solutions. And of course, there are now masses of solutions. And those solutions will mean different things depending on where you're living. If you're living somewhere and there's going to be a massive solar park near you, that will be divisive, but it's worth knowing why that solar park is there and what it's doing. And it's worth knowing that you can build a solar park that benefits the local community economically. It doesn't have to be a solar park that just pays into the pockets of a utility company and the money's never seen again. So there are different ways of doing all these things. So the discussion around the solutions, what they look like, what they mean for people, how those solutions can be designed differently so that they have a more positive impact on local communities. All of that kind of thing, I think, is what we need to raise up the agenda. And then you can do that in all the sort of the usual kind of ways. But I always start with never give up. Seriously, never give up. I've been doing this for 20 years or so now. It's massively depressing. Sometimes I think, what am I doing? I can't stand another minute of this. I'm going to drive myself nuts. I'm doing what? Politics and climate change? Am I completely balmy? Never give up, because this is something that we can't give up on. And so I try and weave it into every conversation, normally apropos of something that's being said. And I do it in very diplomatic ways. But honestly, if we don't talk to each other when we're in the pub or when we're out with our friends or when you meet people that come to your home or whatever it might be, if we don't talk about it, then all the cultural norms of society never get questioned or challenged or changed. So, I mean, obviously you can write to your MP, you can vote according to how you feel about climate change. One ought to really know what the policies of each party are, so that when you're voting, you know which party you think offers you the best policies to address climate change. Join an NGO, be an activist, but don't get arrested. There are obviously, put solar panels on your house if you can afford to do so. I mean, there's obviously lots of things that we can do. And even having solar panels on your home can be a talking point that then raises things up to the agenda, because then you're pointing out actual solutions. I've gone on a lot. Thank you very much. Great question.
Thank you very much. Great answer. Does anybody want to follow up on that before we move on to the next question? I feel like there was quite a lot in there, which people may want to dig into a little bit more. Rupert?
Can I just add to it? The thing that brought it up with me was the surveys we do, because I work for one of the political parties here. The surveys we do around the villages and locally, in West Northants, people are not ticking climate change as one of their top 3 issues. For a lot of them, it's crime, a lot it's immigration, and the others are the health service, which is understandable, or cost of living. But climate change, 3% or something, tick that as an important issue. And similarly, education is not ticked, but climate change is worrying.
Yes. Well, I think that if you look at the national surveys, you do see that the people who are ticking climate change have been going up steadily over the past 10 years or so. At times of cost of living crises, more immediate worries may sort of jump to the foreground, but generally speaking, climate change has been moving up the agenda for voters. And then it depends on also, where you are and what personal experience you've had of it. So if you're living in an area where there have been bad floods and things that are related to climate, then you can tend to be more aware as well.
Yes, I'm sure that's yes. Peter. Oh, Peter, you need to unmute, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Could you say a little bit about the way politics, climate change, and conflict based in climate change, people moving around the world, people hating each other, people encouraged to hate each other, how are they going to interact in time to come? And is it an important matter to consider conflict too?
Yes, so climate change tends to exacerbate problems that already exist. And so problems associated with migration, with inequalities, with conflict over resources, conflict for other reasons, climate change will tend to exacerbate all of those issues. So I suppose sort of like near the beginning when I was trying to explain how to think about climate change politically and also how to move it up political agendas, really understanding that sort of much deeper level of thinking about what climate change is going to do, because I do think that sometimes people just think it's going to be, well, the climate will be a bit different, or it'll be a bit warmer, or we can grow wine in Britain, or if you're Russian, you can start drilling then as the ice caps melt to the north of your region. So I do think that there are ways of thinking about climate change that people perceive as possible, and so this whole notion of explaining it as this factor that will exacerbate already existing issues in society. It'll exacerbate the NHS. I mean, the NHS is obviously under pressure now because it's been very hot and there's been more demand for NHS services. I mean, I think that's one way of explaining why it's important to care about it, is to talk about it in relation to conflict. Clearly, it's hugely depressing, and you don't necessarily want to teach your kids sort of quite that aspect of it in the classroom. Maybe you do. Maybe your kids are all grandkids or whatever massively robust, but I do think that the seriousness of this is important to get across, and that's one of the ways of thinking about how serious it is. But I also, on the other hand, completely believe that we need to talk about the solutions far more than we do, because there are a lot of solutions out there, and many of them are very affordable and doable now, obviously referring to renewables. And energy efficiency, of course, reducing demand is just as important as decarbonising supply.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I think kind of what I take from that last thing that you said is that climate change isn't something that we need to consider and resolve separately. It's something that needs to be woven into absolutely. So it's not a question of having climate change policies, is it? It's a question of having policies that include climate change when it relates to everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a good point, actually, because what's happening, well, in the EU now is that climate is being, and climate specific goals and targets are being integrated across every department, DG, within the EU. So it's no longer sort of sitting just in climate change or where it was mainly in energy and in climate change and environment, but it's now being rolled out across every DG of the EU.
It's good to know, thank you. We'll move on to the next question. So I think this one is a bit of a follow-on, so I'm going to go with this one. I think it's a bit of a paraphrase of a question that Mike Longman asked. So that's just checking Mike is here. So if there are no votes in actually solving issues and voters are attracted by the promise of solutions, are democracies inherently unable to solve the climate change problem? Well, I think that probably links in quite well. And actually, just to follow up on that, I think there are areas in which China, for example, is making a huge amount more progress than some of the Western democracies, simply because they can do whatever they like without having to worry about whether that will affect their chances of getting re-elected, because obviously they don't have elections.
Yeah, well, firstly on China, there are elections in the provinces, and there's a lot of provincial climate change policy, and particularly sustainable energy policy in China. So it's not actually completely unconnected, but clearly questioning is a little bit harder than it is here. But I think that democracies are difficult in that you have these short-term voting cycles, and then in first past the post democracies, where you tend to have sort of two parties that dominate, and usually a more conflictual style of politics, it can be harder. And I'm obviously really here referring to the United States, because actually in the UK this is now a valence issue, so that it is an issue that all political parties in the UK support. So I think sort of that aspect of it has been a big part of why it's been difficult historically, but I think kind of slightly less so now. And I didn't quite sort of understand the sort of solutions part of the problem, because there are all sorts of solutions that we can promise within democracies, and they're all completely doable solutions. So I think actually the promise of solutions is what's going to provide more support ultimately. Because say you're living in a home and your home is uninsulated and you're just leaking all that lovely heat that you're paying a huge amount of money for. If your home then becomes insulated, not only are you going to use less energy, which is great because you'll be reducing emissions, but you'll also have way lower bills. And if your house is not only cold but also damp, there are health issues associated with living in that home. So if we hurry up a little bit in this country and insulate some more homes, then you are providing solutions that are health related, that are affordability and economics related, cost related, and then you're also applying a solution that is climate change and emissions reduction related. So I think actually some of the solutions that are out there are going to be good in democracies and will gain more support. And just sort of the thing I didn't mention earlier was the degree to which political parties in the UK are recognising climate change as an issue that people vote on. It may not be sort of top 3 at the moment in parts of Northants, but it is an issue that increasingly people are voting on, particularly young people who are starting to vote or who've sort of recently started voting. And so all the political parties are very aware of that. And the Conservatives made quite a few changes sort of around 2018, 2019 to sort of take that into account when they were sort of thinking about what policies to pursue or not. So I think that I don't think being in a democracy makes it hard. I think also being in a democracy makes you think about what the other co-benefits are that you can design in to your emissions reduction policy. And when I'm saying co-benefits, I mean health improvement effects, cost improvement effects, all of that kind of thing, because it's forcing you to think about, how can I make this something that people will really actually tangibly, in an economic or social kind of way, get a benefit from, apart from the fact that in this sort of more amorphous kind of way, they're reducing their emissions.
Thank you. Emmy, have you got a question? You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yes, just picking up on that democracy could work with democracy. I completely agree actually about the cycles making things very difficult because of getting really long-term sort of change needs often a long-term sort of economic plan, etc. But I think this was going to be possibly one of my questions. I'm not sure that I need, it's more for a thinking, not, you know, don't expect an answer to a big question. I mean, I noticed already Trump is calling Joe Biden a would-be dictator. I think there is something about when you start going away from markets and democratic ways of doing, which the speed we need to move at. I mean, some people say we need to go onto a war footing in order to create the change at the speed we need, which is really rapid. And it is quicker than any market or current system can do. You almost need benevolent authoritarianism. I don't know what you think about that, Caroline, but
I actually tend to disagree with that, because part of my education, when I studied my undergraduate degree in literature languages, I also did a little bit of politics, and I studied Russia, and I studied the revolution, and I keep thinking about the degree of change that they tried to implement in Russia in the early part of last century. And of course, you know, the thinking behind it was that way more people across society would benefit from a new kind of system. And when you make change on that war type footing, there will be lots and lots of people who disagree with it and who will fight back. And then it's just war. And war, by the way, these days is massively high emissions, because all the technologies that are used to wage war are very high emissions. So I think one really wants to completely reject the notion of a sort of more autocratic or sort of, you know, war footing type approach to this. And I mean, I understand the temptation of it, but I also think that there is an in-between. There's a between war and markets only. And we're not markets only now. I mean, we do govern in this country. We do have a civil service, and they do enact policies. So they are there. They've been reduced, you know, quite a lot over the past, well, since about 2015, but they are there. And so let's put them to work, focusing on climate change as an issue. That will require more capacity, more knowledge, more leadership, etc., etc. But it's there, so let's make use of that resource, because how else are you going to make policy?
Yes, I absolutely see it. I think I was thinking more in terms of the sort of change we've been able to achieve post-war, in the Second World War, and during a war, in terms of the society pulling together, rather than creating a war footing whereby everybody is joined up with a common cause. And COVID was another one, where, you know, there were big rules and the normal democratic sort of processes and markets. It was a very different these times. And I kind of almost echo Rupert's point here, I guess, because we live in villages in rural areas, that, you know, it does feel in some ways that being able to mandate, you know, trying to go just with popular opinions and individuals doing things, that more neoliberal sort of way, it isn't working. It's not going fast enough.
Yes. But I mean, but you don't have to do a neoliberal way. You can do a sort of coordinated market economy kind of way, which is what Germany does and what Denmark does, and well, the Netherlands is sort of somewhere between the two. The Netherlands has mandated that they don't want to produce any more gas from their gas fields, and the Danes have mandated that there will be no more gas used in homes by 2030. And obviously Denmark's a small country and it's much easier to achieve, and probably climate change is a little bit further up voting agendas in Denmark than it is here. But all I'm saying is that that's just a sort of different type of market economy. It's a different way of organizing yourself politically, and it's perfectly possible to do that here. And don't forget that in 2008 the UK implemented the Climate Change Act, and that was groundbreaking in terms of policy at that point in time. And what it did that was super clever, with the benefit of hindsight, was that it made the carbon budgets legally binding. And it set up the Committee on Climate Change to hold the government to account in terms of meeting those budgets. And so, yeah, we're not in a sort of like market only economy at all, are we? And so there's all sorts of things we can do if we put our political minds to it. And that's sort of part of why at the front I was talking about understanding policy and politics better, because the more you rely on markets to solve issues for you, the more you just sort of sit back and go, well, the market's going to do it, and so we don't have to do much. Let's just fire a bunch of civil servants because the market's going to do it all. And it makes you lazy as a government, and it doesn't make you think hard enough about just how deeply political this is, because there will be people who disagree with climate policies. There will be people who lose jobs as a result of climate policies. But you have to make sure that there are enough other people who are really benefiting from those policies. You've got to really think about how to design your policies so that people benefit. And you know, clearly phasing out coal in the 1980s was done in this country not necessarily as an environmental thing, but as part of a sort of different kind of political battle that was going on. But the result of phasing out coal has meant that the UK has reduced its emissions quite rapidly, and more rapidly than a lot of other countries in the world. But it wasn't done very nicely for people who worked in coal industries, and there's parts of this country that are still devastated as a result of the way in which that was done. And so, hey, we can take some learning from that, can't we? And you can look at Alberta in Canada, or again back at Germany, and where they've gone, okay, which are the regions in our country where people are employed by these industries? Okay, how many jobs are at risk? We're going to tell them this number of years in advance. We're going to organize these reskilling and retraining into new types of energy industries. And they've really thought. In Canada, they've compensated not the owners of coal companies, but the workers in coal companies for losing their jobs. So there's all sorts of ways that you can organize this, and we know about them because we've researched them. So I think that I'm much more positive that there is a middle ground between mandating and having more rules. I think we should have more rules, but I don't think we should do it in a way that alienates too many people, because I think populism is what happens when you alienate too many people.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I think actually you probably answered there a question that came into the chat, which is about, are there any examples of political systems and economies doing a good job? So I think you gave several examples there. And I guess perhaps the answer might be, and I'd welcome your thoughts on this, that maybe a lot of places are doing some things really well, but perhaps it's difficult to point at somewhere that's doing everything well.
I think that's exactly right. And as you were sort of reading that question out, I was thinking, I don't think I would give anyone an A star for what they're doing on climate change, but there's aspects of what countries do that is really positive. And one of the really difficult things is what you do with your incumbent fossil fuel industries. So if you're a country that doesn't have a coal or an oil or a gas industry, things are a little bit easier in terms of thinking about how to phase out So for Denmark, phasing out gas is sort of a consumption question, but it's not a question in terms of what revenues do we get as a government from oil or gas or coal, how many jobs are associated with those industries. So in any country where there is a fossil fuel, an established incumbent fossil fuel industry, you'll always find that that's the bit that's going a bit more slowly. So if you look at Norway, they've done sort of all sorts of incredibly clever and interesting things around EV uptake, around building out infrastructures to support EVs. They have a lot of hydro there anyway, so their electricity is pretty clean. They've done a lot, but they're a big oil and gas producer, and they're selling lots of it, and they're just doing another round of licensing for further extraction projects. So you can see how difficult it is when you have an incumbent oil and gas industry. I'd say that the UK kind of has a bit of the same problem. They don't make the same amount of money in terms of government revenues from oil and gas as Norway does, but there is a lot of influence of particularly the gas lobby in the UK in terms of what we read in our papers, but also in terms of how our government is informed. But then there are countries, but then back to Germany, it's got a huge coal lobby and massive coal industries, and particularly coal is a big employer in the parts of Germany that are particularly poor. And so to get rid of those jobs is very, very difficult politically. So Germany has done badly because obviously coal is the highest emitting fossil fuel. And so that's really affected their decarbonisation numbers. But they've done fabulously well on energy efficiency and on insulating homes. They got the National Development Bank, the KFC, to implement energy efficiency loans. So you could get a loan at 0.01%. And they got the development bank to make a whole load of grants available to people who couldn't afford to borrow money to insulate their homes. And this was an ongoing policy over 10 or more years. And during that time frame, a lot of Germany's homes became insulated. And that meant that the cost of heating your home came down massively for many German people. And then it became a really strongly embedded policy because energy efficiency industries, all the sort of small and medium-sized industries, businesses that grow up around energy efficiency type products, they all started to thrive. And then they're embedded in ensuring that you keep doing that kind of thing. So so every country's got a bit of good and a bit of bad, and sort of Germany's a good example, UK is a good example, Norway is a good example.
Thank you, that's really interesting. I think reinforces the overall message that on the whole climate change is quite complicated. I'm just going to move on to the next question now, which is sort of a bit more of a specific question around energy. Climate Action-West Northants has been taking a bit of an interest in the passage of the local electricity bill through Parliament, because to touch on something that you mentioned right at the beginning, I think the intention is that it will help to enable local renewable energy projects, which are currently perhaps more difficult to set up than they should be and don't always offer impressive financial incentives to the local community. And I know that this is something that you've done some work on in the past. You wrote a policy briefing in 2019 on this sort of topic. I'm just wondering if you could give us your thoughts on that and whether in fact the local electricity bill is likely to deliver what we would like.
Yeah, well, this particular bill, it's sort of quite focused on trying to make generating renewable electricity within localities a bit easier to do by allowing for much more local trading. So being able to, say you have a solar farm and then you can just talk to businesses or groups of houses in the locality and then just do a more direct kind of trade. And currently, and I won't start to even peel back the outer layer of this onion, but suffice to say that the rules and regulations governing electricity and gas trading in this country were really designed at the time of privatization and liberalization, and they were designed to try and keep electricity and gas companies behaving themselves sufficiently so that the costs to consumers wouldn't be too high. These are all obviously mainly, or were at that time, very large corporations that really dominated gas and electricity until reasonably recently. But those rules and regulations are not put in place for this renewable future that we've already started to live in. And so all sorts of rules and regulations need now to be changed if we are going to have this more distributed energy future. And renewables allow us to have a more distributed electricity system, because renewables can be put, like, as we know, pretty much anywhere. They can be rooftop, they can be sort of local, they can be medium sized, they can be offshore wind, they can be sort of all sorts of different things. But in order to facilitate that a little bit better, you do need to change a bunch of rules, and that's what this proposal that's going through Parliament sets out to do. But what the proposal does was it covers like a little section of what needs to change, but it doesn't cover by any means the other things that need to change. And obviously the main obstacle is still around planning permission for onshore renewables, onshore wind and onshore solar. Onshore wind is the cheapest form of electricity available to us in the UK, but it is essentially blocked at the moment because of planning rules associated with getting your project off the ground and built.
That's very interesting, thank you. Yes. I think there's a review of the National Planning Policy Framework underway at the moment, so it'll be interesting to see whether it does anything to help give better planning permission to renewables. Rupert, yes.
But we are being asked to write to our MP to support keeping clauses 272 and 273 in, which the House of Commons is hoping to chuck out. The laws has put in, so I'm told. I don't really understand it all. Could you just do you know something about that, Caroline? Can you enlarge on that for us?
Are you talking about the local electricity bill?
That's right. The local electricity bill has got these two clauses, and I've been asked by powerful people to write to our MP asking that he support Energy Bill 272, 272 and 273.
Okay, I'm not familiar with those particular policies, I'm afraid. But I mean, having read through that bill quickly earlier today, when you brought my attention to it, I think that everything that's in there needs to happen, but also an awful lot more. I mean, that bill is the tip of the iceberg of what needs to change in regulatory terms, but also in planning terms, to allow more renewables in localities.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that as well? Because another one of the obstacles that we're constantly being told is a major problem is the ability of the grid to accept power generated by local renewable solar farms or onshore wind. Is that purely a matter of logistical capacity, or would changing some of those rules and regulations help that too?
Ooh, again, you're asking me to peel back more layers of that onion. Yeah, the grid is a big problem. It's a big problem, but it is. People who are interested in sustainable energy have known for 10 years, 15 years that the grid is going to be an issue. And so one of the first projects I started working on back in 2012, we wrote all sorts of papers about how to re-regulate the distribution networks and the transmission networks in this country. And you know, Ofgem made like little changes here and little changes there, but unfortunately the grid is still the major obstacle, and it is about spending the money and doing the work. Some parts of the UK, so in Bristol, they've built some of their own network because they were just a little bit too tired of waiting. So in Bristol, as a city, the local authority has invested in quite a lot of renewables, and then it wanted to make sure that they could use the renewables within their locality so that their locality would benefit from those renewables. And so they just built the grid. So and they sort of did it quite cleverly. I think part of it was done, they knew, like, if all these, they're all in pipes together, aren't they, these things? So they knew that if the road was being dug up for some gas, or if it was being dug up for some Wi-Fi or whatever that stuff's called, then they did it at the same time, put the new wires in. So you can do it, but it costs a fair amount of money. But if you've got a business model whereby you're making the electricity and you want to sell it in your locality, and you've got a business model that allows you to do that, then it maybe is worthwhile. But yeah, the grid's the big problem, and rules and regulations have to change. One of the things that's being discussed also in Parliament at the moment is giving Ofgem a new overriding goal, as it were. So Ofgem's current overriding responsibility is to ensure the affordability and accessibility of gas and electricity, which is obviously not under their control because gas prices are not under the control of Ofgem. But there is a bill going through now to change Ofgem's overriding responsibility to put GHG emissions reduction on a par with affordability and accessibility. But they have a lot of work to do. And honestly, if you wanted to, until quite recently, if you wanted to set up a new electricity company, a retail company selling to sort of people like us, you would be sent the rule book from Ofgem, and the rule book is about this fat, and it would land on your desk. And I know people who've set up electricity companies, and they would just have to hire a team of people for about 3 months to read the rule book, and then they'd spend 3 months trying to understand the rule book. So yeah, so Ofgem has a lot of work to do.
Yes, let's hope they get on with it then. Right, thank you very much. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Moving on to the next question then. Again, this is a slight paraphrase of a question that Mike sent in, but hopefully he will recognise that it still asked the question that he wanted to, which is that there seems to be a lack of climate adaptation policies and planning. You know, that there's a lot of talk about mitigation and cutting greenhouse gas emissions, but there isn't a lot of talk about how we need to adapt to the impacts that we are going to feel. And is this because politicians are under the impression that delivering net zero will immediately halt global warming, whereas in fact temperatures might will continue to rise for a really long time?
Yeah, so I mean, adaptation has been the poor relation of mitigation in a lot of countries, actually. And you see it more often in those countries where it's harder for people to understand just how negative the implications of climate change might be. And I think the UK is definitely one of those places. I mean, I don't know if when you're talking to people that you know and you talk about climate change, I mean, I do very often hear, well, at least we can grow wine in this country now, and other of those kinds of comments. So I think when you're sort of a northern country that's sort of used to pretty crap weather and et cetera, and obviously the English love to talk about the weather, it's sort of a big preoccupation. So I think that for actually some politicians, as well as the public in general, there isn't a really, really clear picture that adaptation is going to be needed, because it's just going to be a bit warmer and you know, and anyway, we've got all these mitigation policies in place, so we don't have to worry about adaptation. You see a bit more action on adaptation around certain localities and around certain local authorities, actually, particularly in areas that are more vulnerable. So some of our coastal areas and areas that are particularly vulnerable to flooding. So you do see more adaptation sort of at the local authority level. but it's really not been a big deal at the national policy level in the UK, and I don't know why that is, but that seems as good an explanation. Who was it, Mike, who wrote that as any?
Yeah.
And also, of course, it costs, you know, adaptation costs, and if you're not really feeling that you need to do it, then you're probably going to place your money elsewhere as a government.
Yes, I mean, it will cost a huge amount of money, but then obviously dealing with the consequences if you don't adapt will cost a lot too. Yeah,
absolutely. But again, that's that whole tangibility question, isn't it? It's like, well, there might be costs in future, and will those costs be for me, or will they be for somebody else? And so it's it's, you know, bridging that gap between the degree of those costs in the future, which I think people aren't really aware of either, and helping them to understand that those costs are worth avoiding because they just are so huge.
Yeah. And I'm going to, because we're running out, I wanted to have a little bit of time left at the end of the meeting just to cover some other things, so I'm going to sort of try and bring this section of the meeting to a close a little bit now. Sorry, Alexina, if you've got a question though before I do that.
Oh, don't worry. I mean, I can get Caroline anytime, Jane. But so if you want to crack on then with the other stuff, then I'm happy to.
All right. Well, in which case, Michael, if you've got a question.
Hi.
Hi. Yes. What did you want to ask? We're not getting you.
Something. There's something earlier about the need for us to get moving, and I think it was Emmy referred to this concept of like a benevolent dictatorship. So I would like to ask this: the economy as we currently live in it relies on quite a lot of frivolous activity, and the state power structure is, as I think we all know, notoriously poorly equipped to respond to human needs with much effectiveness, let alone speed. So I would like to know how you think we can reconcile the requirement of, you know, structural degrowth with the routes that the state currently makes available to us to effect change, particularly since the ecological crisis is not merely to do with carbon parts per million, but many different forms of ecological destruction. I think if we focus on advocating policies that just, you know, aim to bring numbers down, you know, what do we really expect the power structure to do besides ramp up the violence, really?
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that my answer will be like similar to one of the answers I gave previously, because you just have to bring people with you. And if you don't bring people with you, then you just end up being, you know, Lenin or someone like that. And I do agree that there is room for more regulation, and there is room for more sticks and less carrots. So the style of policy thus far has been quite sort of incentive based, and that has to do with the market mentality, the sort of we'll set some targets and then we'll set some incentives, and then it will make it more profitable for people to, or more affordable for people to make the changes that they need to make. But that's kind of for me, like a very passive way of going about making policy. And so what I have been advocating so far this evening is stepping far more heavily into the space of making public policy, and making well-informed public policy that focuses on skills, that focuses on education, that focuses on the co-benefits that you can bring with reducing emissions. I don't think that we should just be reducing emissions. I think that we should also be improving quality of life, whether that's, you know, to do with insulating homes, whether that's to do with making electricity more affordable because renewables are more affordable, and renewables can be far more accessible as a form of energy as well. It also is good in geopolitical terms, of course, if the UK is more independent. But I see that there are some hands up, so I'll stop because I know we're also pressed for time.
I quickly reply to that. Thank you so much. That's a really you know, well thought out answer, and I understand what you're saying. I would just say that it seems clear that a lot of these ideas depend on us regular people having a great deal of trust in structures which prove time and again insufficient to deal with even people's basic needs. It seems to me that the most direct thing to do that doesn't rely on us having faith in a class of people whose interests contradict our needs is to try and build popular power and focus on collectively unhooking our reliance from the destructive system to survive, and fundamentally to focus on how we can sustain the whole population without subjugating anybody and without polluting. You pointed out Germany's coal industry. I really don't think that, you know, that, like, you can't isolate one action from another. You know, they shouldn't necessarily be held up as a model really for climate policy. They've physically harmed many land protectors just this year at the coal mine site that people were obstructing in the west of Germany. You know, electric vehicles aren't necessarily a real solution. They're quite a short-term solution, basically. They depend on the extraction of relatively finite minerals, and these supply chains are only ever established with the submission of the nation state that the minerals come from, usually by some form of political violence. That means a death toll of impoverished.
But Michael, can I just stop you for a sec? Because I just think that, what are you advocating? Sort of a popular uprising?
Not simply, no. I think that there are ways that we can sustain the population that don't depend on.
Yeah, but how are you gonna make sure that those ways are implemented? Because at the moment, you know, not enough people would be on board with this for it to be particularly popular, I don't think.
The reason why people wouldn't be on board with it isn't because the idea doesn't have merit or logic, but rather just because it's quite unknown, and it would be through
but you've still got to get from now to where it's known, and people don't know things in an instant. When you think about norms and culture and why people always have reasons for like why they're doing the things that they're doing, and so what you have to do is you have to get them from here, which is, well, climate change is an issue, but maybe it's number 4 on my list, or maybe it's number 5 on my list, etc., to where they really are interested in taking proactive change. But also, for a lot of people, they can't afford to take that kind of proactive change at the moment, and they can't afford to particularly care about it at the moment. So that's also why I would advocate for policies that make improvements that help parts of society that are currently pretty much not being helped by government policies. And so that way you can engender more trust rather than saying, right, you know, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, without having really empowered anyone in that process through helping them to understand why they need to do it, or that kind of thing.
I'm sorry, Peter, you've got your hand up. You need to unmute, I'm afraid. Peter, you're on mute at the moment.
I think it's extraordinarily difficult to bring in the climate change things required, let's put it that simply, when so much of the population, I suspect, if they knew the word, would agree with me that we live in a kleptocracy. The whole business about the rich and the poor, and to hell with you if you've got a mental problem and care needs and all the rest of it, means that there's little readiness to think of those other things. So it's as if climate change needs are the bad news that are being buried in all these other horrors that people are experiencing. And just as an irrelevant PS to that, my own interests are in wildlife diversity, and I'm particularly concerned too about the methane in the north. But neither of those things get very much of a mention in all this. Certainly our environment is rubbish, and as uncertainly, the methane situation across the north of the planet is extraordinarily dodgy. But the kleptocracy thing, I would vote to change that.
Yes.
Your comments.
Yeah, well, the methane thing is an issue which has been hidden somewhat with the focus on carbon emissions. So obviously the global agreement is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, of which methane is probably up there in terms of its impacts. And there's a lot of methane being released. There's a lot of methane being released as sort of gas is just burnt off. Like Russia is probably the sort of the worst offender in terms of methane release. But our ability to control Russia is non-existent, low. But you know, it's happening in UK fields, it's happening in Norwegian fields. It's there's methane being released in lots of places, and I think that that's an issue that since about not last COP before, that started to be much more of a talking point at that sort of global UN level than it had been for a long time. But it hasn't really sort of trickled down to sort of public debates where I don't think people necessarily realise that sort of methane is an issue. I think most people just say carbon, don't they? Say reducing carbon. They're not so aware of the other emissions. But again, that has to do with education. It has to do with our media. It has to do with how people hear the story of climate change, and the story of environment becomes the story of climate change. It's been sort of narrowed down so much just to get our attention sufficiently so that we can do something about it. And the kleptocracy, well, you know, don't start me.
Okay.
Thank you. I think we better wrap it up there. I think that's been a really interesting and lively discussion, and I think has given us an awful lot to think about and to act on going forward. And apologies to anybody who put a question in that we haven't been able to ask, but I hope that even if it hasn't answered your specific question, that we've still got a lot out of this and learned a great deal.
Yeah, because the comment from Mike in the chat about Tuvalu is a really good one. And when I was at COP, not last one, but the one before, the one in the UK in Glasgow, I went to the Tuvalu stand, and it's extraordinary how they produce images to help you understand what climate change means for that particular small island country. And they're in obviously it's a very small population, and they're all engaged, but the sorts of things they're doing are really interesting.
Yes, no, I agree. And of course they are an area that, absolute contrast, the UK can completely see what the impact will be on everybody. Yeah, you know, which is obviously a very mixed blessing. But thank you very much indeed, Caroline, for taking the time to talk to us tonight. That's been really, really invaluable. I hope that people who weren't able to make the meeting will be able to watch it back. We'll make the recording available, and obviously we'll issue some meeting notes. And yes, thanks very much.
Well, thanks.
You're welcome to stay for our remaining 6 minutes. We have got some other sort of internal business to cover, but you may want to.
I'll go and have a glass of wine.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Lovely to meet you, and your questions were great. Thank you. I really enjoyed them.
Oh no,
really
yeah, your answers were excellent too. Thank you very much.
Take care then. Bye-bye.
Bye. I think I'm going to have to slightly curtail the rest of the agenda. I'm going to canter very quickly through. Well, I'll aim to canter very quickly through some upcoming events, which I just wanted to mention. So on Saturday, there is an afternoon of family activities going on in Yelvertoft. You can see the details of that on our What's On page on Corn Exchange. So if anybody's in the vicinity of Yelvertoft and interested in things like bug hunting and pond dipping, then do look at that. We've been invited to attend an event in Milton Keynes on Saturday, the 24th of June, organised by the One campaign, which I think is a global anti-poverty campaign. There's quite a few other interesting sounding people going, so I think it'd be a good opportunity to go and network. We've got people coming from Milton Keynes Council, Network Rail, Milton Keynes Green Party, so a fairly broad spectrum. If anybody has any interest in attending that and helping to represent Corn, then please do let me know. There is a Sustainable Futures Summit at the University of Northampton on Saturday, the 1st of July, which is billed as a community event aimed at promoting environmental and sustainability campaigns. Corn has been asked to facilitate a session on retrofitting homes for energy efficiency as part of that. I can't see that sort of registration for that event is open yet, but we will make it available to people as soon as it is. On July the 8th, there is an informal a social event at the gathering at the Grosvenor Centre, which is, we bill it as a sort of tea and cake with corn, because it is literally just about turning up for a cup of tea and having a chat and perhaps just connecting with people face to face if you haven't had the chance to do that before. So everyone is welcome to come along to that. Again, more details on our What's On page. And looking a good bit further ahead, Cornwall has been invited by Friends of the Earth to share some space with them at the Shambhala Festival, which is taking place over the August bank holiday weekend. We would need to provide some volunteers to cover that. So really, they've been given 4 tickets for the whole weekend, but they're not allowed to split the tickets between different people. So ideally, we would want people to go who are able to cover a minimum of 1 whole day, ideally multiple days, so that we can have people represented. We can be there represented as much as possible across the whole of the 4 days. So it's a little bit far ahead. Got a meeting with Friends of the Earth to discuss more details next week, but really looking to sort of gauge what level of volunteers we might have available to cover that. So please do get in touch with me as soon as possible if that's something you might be interested in. Sorry, that was super speedy. And so that's it on the events front. The other main thing that we wanted to cover was to review some options for our visual displays, but I don't know, Harry, do you think we've still got time to do that? Would you rather do it another time or another way even?
Yeah, let me explain the dilemma. We've been gifted a very large display stand that's empty. So essentially it's like an advertising hoarding with nothing on it. And we've struggled to think what we would want to put on it. Whatever we do would be precisely appropriate only on a few occasions. We're looking for some inspiration. The current thought would be a field full of beautiful flowers growing in budbrook, just because it's really pretty and it would symbolize a lot of what of the bees that we have in our bonnet. And we could then supplement that for any particular situation with an additional bit of poster. For example, if we were trying to get people to sign up and read the Corn Exchange, we just put a QR code for the Corn Exchange. But I wondered whether that was too naive an approach, and I wonder if anybody's got any ideas. That from a practical viewpoint, the crowds that pass us when we go out in public don't really understand what it's all about. They do need symbols of some sort, but complicated conversations, long sentences, it's a bit like PowerPoint presentations. It's got to be really pictorial and really simple. And I don't mean because we are preaching to the lowest common denominator of human intellect. I mean, it's just because it's really difficult to, if you've got a pushchair at a person wandering past, to engage with someone who really would be very worthwhile talking to. So we can circulate the pictures that we've done as a sort of mock-up, but I'm really grateful for any inspiration from anybody, please. Not looking for an instant answer, clearly.
It is a real conundrum, isn't it? Because we all know what it's like. Go on.
Harry, I was at the Barclaycard event, and one person had a big stand, which was probably 7 foot tall by 10 foot, and it was just a whole load of green leaves. And it was absolutely lovely. And people were able to stand in front of it and take their photo, have their photo with the background. And I thought it was very effective. So I'm kind of imagining perhaps your wildflowers, a similar vein, a similar idea. And I could get a picture of that and show it to you if you wanted.
Yes, thank you.
I think because the issue is, again, because what Harry said was, you know, obviously if we put lots of words on, you start narrowing down how useful the display is going to be. And perhaps the real need is for it simply to be eye-catching, you know, just to be something that people will want to look at, rather than actually trying to convey any specific messages, because I think experience tells us people don't read them.
Yeah, visually, I just think the most wondrous thing is a bee as well. And when I'm talking to people, a lot of people are saying they're not seeing many bees. I don't know whether that's something as well. They are wondrous to look at in very close to.
Yes, I can visualize that immediately. I mean, it really is a big bit of real estate that we've got to carry around. And I think, you know, 5 Harry-sized bees could be really quite, as a talking point. Yeah. You're right, bees. I have to say, today I was out in the garden and I was looking and I could see loads of bees, and it's the most I've seen in a really long time. So I felt a lot better about things after that.
Good. I've yet to really see them, but yes, people do kind of know. You know, most people sort of know that the pollinators are. There is a distraction there in the sense that we might come across as being single issue, which is why green leaves just sounds a nice, but nonetheless highly symbolic. Yes, agreed. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thank you. So
I only have.
Bye, Peter. Yeah. Thank you. Bye bye. I had one other thing to mention, so I'm just going to mention it really quickly because it will literally just take me 30 seconds. Which is that we'd recently published a list of other local climate and environmental groups on Corn Exchange, which Ella's not here tonight, but thanks to her for sort of making it happen and doing the work on it. Hopefully it will prove useful for other groups to connect with each other. And we were now looking to try and take that a bit further by taking another version of that list and starting to put contacts against it and trying to more proactively reaching out to some of those groups, because there will all be people that we've interacted with in some way in the past, but we're probably not keeping that alive very much. So we're looking to try and move on to doing that. And again, as always, if anybody has any interest, in getting involved in that work, so possibly if you've got local groups near you that you'd be willing to reach out to and keep in contact with, then that would be great. And also if you have a look at the list on Corn Exchange and there's something on there that we haven't included, then do let us know, because we want it to be as comprehensive as possible. That covers everything that I wanted to say. Does anybody else have any other business? Just to say that we will hang around for another 10 minutes or so for a bit of an informal chat, as we always do, if anybody wants to save anything till then. But has anybody got any sort of questions to raise during this part of the meeting that we haven't covered all? Okay. In which case I shall just say thank you all very much for attending. I hope you enjoyed that meeting. I found it a really stimulating and interesting discussion. I think we probably could have gone on for another couple of hours, to be perfectly honest, but yeah.
Thank you. It was really good.
Yeah, really glad. Yes, so thank you all very much, and hope to see you all soon at some point.
Thanks. Brilliantly chaired as always.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
2 questions when I've got a moment.
Yes.
Jane, we're not on the Power for People list. I think I sent you something about that in an email today.